Welcome to Wannamaker Park. Join me in my meditation on Matthew 22, verses 1 through 14, as I play some disc golf and seek to glorify the Lord for His Word, for His world, for His Redeemer. In Matthew 21, we saw Jesus, through a series of stories and debate, dress down the chief priests and the elders, calling them on their hardness of heart and their eventual overthrow through their inability to see Him as the Christ. Chapter 21 ended with the chief priest and the scribes seeking to arrest Jesus in an incredibly political move, but needing to do so in secret because they fundamentally feared the crowds who saw Jesus as a prophet. It's into this context that Matthew tells us in the top of 22 that Jesus again spoke to them in parables, and I think his audience has turned back to the people at large. He's resuming his old pattern of speaking in parables to the people. Verse 2 is important that we understand because this is where we get the context. And in the midst of the details of the next 10 or so verses, it's easy to miss it, but it says that the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. With parables, we see Jesus telling stories, usually with one central truth, but there is an element of allegory to it. So at some point, we're going to need to identify who is the king and who is the son. In light of this wedding feast, we're told that the king sent his servants out to call those who are invited to the wedding feast, but for some reason they would not come. It is so foolish to offend the king who desires to celebrate the marriage of his son by ignoring his invitation. When they refuse to come, the king sends out more servants with more details. He's prepared the feast, the oxen, the fatted calves have been slaughtered. He invites them to come, partake in the celebration of the wedding of his son. But these guests just ignore the king's servants, going to find other things to do, one to his farm, another to his business, and we see that others are even more terrible in their refusal to celebrate the king and his son. We see those that were anything other than apathetic about the king's invitation, instead of coming and celebrating, seized the king's servants, treating them shamefully and even killing them. This is an offense to the king. They can't get at the king, so they're happy to kill his servants. Unsurprisingly, the king is furious. His son has been offended. He has been offended. And so he gathers his troops and they go and they destroy the whole city. He puts to death those wretched murderers. Given the parables that Jesus has told up to this point, I think we can take a beat and consider what is happening here. Jesus has told us that the King is God the Father, and He, Jesus Christ, is the Son. And a wedding feast is being prepared, and God's chosen people are the invited guests, Israel and Judah. They have spurned the message of the prophets, even putting God's servants, His prophets, His priests, to death in their rejection of Him as their God. And I believe here Jesus is providing a prophecy that because of her rejection of God and her Son, Jesus Christ, and ultimately of the bride of Christ, the church, Jerusalem will be burned to the ground. We then see some good news, because we're told that the king, assessing the situation, tells his servants, go. The original invitees were not worthy to celebrate this wedding. Go to the wild places, the highways, the byroads, and invite as many as you can find. And hear the good news that the king's servants went out and filled the wedding hall with as many guests as they could find, both the good and the bad. The king is inviting all kinds, Jew and Gentile, sinner and self-righteous, to come together to celebrate the wedding supper of his Son. And this is indeed glorious good news, that we would be invited in to celebrate the wedding supper of the Lamb. And so we see an open call and an open invitation to come at the invitation of the King to celebrate the Son. But in the next paragraph, we see that just to say yes is no guarantee of the outcome, that we'll be invited to stay for the whole supper. The king comes in to look at his guests, and he sees a guest with no wedding garment, inappropriately dressed for the occasion. The king's initial request is friendly enough. He says, "Friend, how did you come in here without a wedding garment?" But the man is speechless, unable to respond. The man's disobedient unwillingness to respond to the king's question causes the king to call his attendants and say, "Bind him hand and foot, and cast the man into the outer darkness." We're told that in that place there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We see from this story that it seems there's more than one way to fail to enter in to this marriage supper thrown by God the Father for the Son. We can reject Christ outright, reject God's prophets, his servants, those who tell us his purpose and his message for us. By doing so, whether through apathy or active hatred of God, we join with those who will ultimately suffer the wrath of God poured out upon them. Alternatively, we can rejoice that the invitation has been broadened to include both Jew and Gentile. The call to come and join in the wedding supper of the Lamb has been extended to so many. But we must also be forewarned that simply to come, again, the invitation is given to the good and the bad, is not in itself sufficient. We must come to the wedding feast, but we must come to the wedding feast properly clothed. We must indeed claim Christ and enter into the body of believers who are rejoicing together in their King, but it's not enough simply to do that externally. We must indeed do that and more, be clothed in the righteousness of Christ. To just show up, to crash the party without adequate preparation, is to invite dire consequences, those worse than death, the outer darkness. For it turns out that those who attend the marriage supper of the Son do so at the good pleasure of the King, and at his good pleasure alone. And so Jesus explains this parable with one line when he says, "For many are called, but few are chosen." We do well to let this psalm literally put the fear of God in us, and to beg the King to make us worthy to join in the marriage supper of his Son. And so may we rejoice in Christ and his willingness to teach us to trust in him alone, to enter the wedding supper of the Lamb. May we meditate on his word, that we might understand these parables, particularly these parables that the gospel writers do not go on to explicitly explain to us. And may we enjoy the world God has made as we look forward to that new world which is to come, when we will join in the marriage supper of the Lamb. May the King in his glory find us properly dressed, clothed in the righteousness of Christ, to join in this feast of heaven. Until next time.